At this point, benchmarks are going to be the death of the M2 MacBook Air, because apparently there are a lot of problems with this device, ranging from a slow SSD to overheating issues to the laptop suddenly levitating and flying away. Okay, the last one was a joke, but you get the gist. Anyway, I don't think you should pay too much attention to all those benchmarks. Here's why. If you know me, then you know I'm usually the last person to defend Apple. I mean, I'm not a hater or anything. Well, sometimes I am. Shh. But I do find some of their practices to be a little bit distasteful sometimes. Apple is a $1 trillion company, and of course they did not get there by making decisions which always favor the consumers. Sometimes they had to make profit-focused decisions and products, such as making Stage Manager only available for the M1 iPads, taking the chargers out of the box, putting 16 gigabytes of RAM on an iPad. I mean, seriously, think about it. It's an iPad. It's got great software and a super efficient chip. You're just paying more for RAM that you will never use. And the biggest of all profit grabs, performance throttling on the Intel MacBooks and even older iPhones. I know a lot of people think this is a conspiracy theory and it's quite a subjective matter, but let's see how well your iPhone 11 performs in a couple of years. Just saying. Back to the topic at hand though. There have been a lot of videos dissing the M2 MacBook Air for thermal throttling issues and even worse performance with the 256GB SSD model. And while I don't have the M2 MacBook Air just yet, it takes a while to get to Nigeria, I have watched a couple of videos from other creators and I've listened to their comments on all of these issues. And having done that, I do believe some of the points I have to talk about in this video are still valid. The first thing I'd like to point out is, not everyone is going to use their M2 MacBook Air the exact same way. I believe Apple designed this device with people who don't have a very tedious workload in mind. People like students who just want to write some documents, watch Netflix or YouTube, and maybe do some photo or video editing with Lightroom or Final Cut, all of which the M2 MacBook Air should be able to handle with no problems. I don't expect a professional video editor who works with multiple streams of 4K or 8K videos while downloading assets from one of their 35 Chrome tabs to opt for the base model M2 MacBook Air. I mean, that type of workload would be much better suited for a MacBook Pro. Another important thing to consider would be the fact that the M2 chip might still require a couple of software tweaks to help it get perfectly optimized. And I know you don't buy a device based on the promises of software updates or new features. You need to buy it based on what it can do right now. But just hear me out. The architecture of the M2 chip isn't that much different to that of the M1 chip. However, taking into account the fact that the M2 Air doesn't have fans to cool itself and it's in a new chassis, the M2 chip might still need a bit of software tinkering to help it regulate heat more efficiently. Plus, most of the throttling was discovered when the M2 MacBook Air was placed under extreme conditions, like exporting 8K footage. So it's not like it's a problem which everyone is going to experience. It's a bit of a stretch, yes, but it's also a possibility. One thing that's been concerning a lot of people is the use of a single NAND chip on the 256GB MacBook Air. According to the benchmarks, this use of a single chip is reported to give up to 50% slower SSD read speeds and 30% slower write speeds compared to the M1 MacBook Air. And this issue seems to only affect the 256GB model, as the other M2 storage configurations come with several smaller storage NAND chips, allowing them to attain faster speeds in parallel. But as always, benchmarks don't tell the full story and your real-world experience might vary, which brings me to my next point. But before that, if you've been enjoying the video, then a sub to the channel would be greatly appreciated. And let me know in the comment section below how many gigabytes of internal storage your current laptop or PC has. Some people are going to opt for a higher spec M2 MacBook Air because of their workload. Perhaps they just need more RAM or even more storage. So whether you go for the model with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512GB SSD or even more, as long as you're not one of those people who's getting the base model, then you don't need to worry about any of these issues. And for those of you considering getting the base model M2 MacBook Air, then I can confidently say you don't have much to worry about. At least not as much as the benchmarks would lead you to believe. Most of these benchmarks were conducted with Geekbench and were focused on values obtained in hypothetical and isolated conditions. They go on to give CPU and GPU performance statistics, but the results have been shown to be somewhat inconsistent from tester to tester. Benchmarks are great and all, don't get me wrong, but they have been proven time and again to be insufficient with regards to telling the full story of a device. And some companies out there program their devices to perform a particular way when they detect a benchmark app, as opposed to performing normally like they would during day-to-day activities. Samsung. But going back to the issue being addressed, the base model M2 MacBook Air certainly doesn't deserve a lot of the hate it's been getting, especially considering the fact that most of the critics haven't even spent enough time using this device like a regular consumer would. And I know in my previous video, I did not recommend getting the base model M2 MacBook Air, and that's because, well, I'll just let Past Johannes explain. Don't get me wrong, you'll most likely still be fine with 8GB of RAM, but when you begin to open a few Chrome tabs and then you're watching Netflix and you've got a few other processes running in the background, you might begin to wish you had a bit more RAM. And as a wise man once said, it is better to have but not need than to need but not have. Yeah, I was the wise man. I said that. You might watch a couple of videos telling you to go for the base model M2 MacBook Pro with 8GB of RAM and 256GB of storage, but personally, I have a principle of never getting the base model if you plan on using a device for a prolonged period of time. I still have nightmares of being stuck with a 32GB smartphone, and it is a fate I do not wish upon my worst enemies. Dealing with all the files, documents, and projects you get from schoolwork is definitely going to consume quite a bit of space on your device. And it's well known that once your MacBook runs out of space, it starts slowing down. And I know you don't want that. So what I recommend is getting the 1TB SSD version if you can, just to be safe. And if you're a bit more constricted with regards to your budget, then you can get the 512GB SSD version, but you will need to get some external storage just in case. Look, I'll be really straight with you. If you're on a really tight budget, then I would still recommend getting the M1 MacBook Air instead, because it's still incredibly capable, has little to no stability issues, and is considerably cheaper, so you can opt for a higher spec version of it for the same price as the base model M2 MacBook Air. However, if you're really into the new design of the M2 MacBook Air, as well as the new speakers, new webcam, and MagSafe charging, but you can only afford the base model, then you can safely get it, but only if you meet these conditions. You have to be someone who doesn't plan on doing a lot of intensive work on your laptop. 8GB of RAM is not as much as you think, and a few Chrome tabs are enough to eat up a considerable chunk of that, so keep that in mind. You shouldn't be thinking of getting the base model if you're a heavy user. You also need to be okay with the possibility of slightly slower speeds with the 256GB SSD, but as I mentioned earlier, this seems to be largely inconsistent and we won't really know until we get our hands on one. But with only 256GB of storage, I doubt you're going to be keeping a lot of stuff on your inbuilt SSD, so you're going to want to invest in an external SSD instead. Something like the Acasis 10-in-1 hub, which is practically the Swiss Army knife of USB hubs and portable storage, as not only does it have several additional ports which are missing from the MacBook, but it also has a slot where you can pop in an NVMe SSD and turn it into an external storage drive. It's really lightweight and portable, as it's small enough to fit into your pocket, but if you just want a regular SSD that you can plug into your MacBook and start using immediately, then my friend Patrick has made a couple of videos where he helps you make a decision on which SSD is best for you. At this point, I hope it's become pretty clear to see that the base model M2 MacBook Air isn't as doomed as the benchmarks would lead you to believe it is. Sure, it's not the perfect computer, and the single NAND chip might have been an error on Apple's part, but I strongly believe that there's still a group of people out there who are going to buy the base model M2 MacBook Air and have an amazing time with it. And that's what's most important, the user experience, right? And if you enjoyed this video, then you can check out my video on which M2 MacBook Air configuration is best for students, or you can pick another video from the playlist showing right now. But before you go there, subscribe to the channel.